Well, hey, happy Monday.
Hey, man. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm pretty good. So, obviously a different angle here. So normally Brendan's host, but today I'm hosting because Brendan had the opportunity to teach.
Yeah.
So, which again, man, I thought you did really well. First time kind of teaching in that capacity, I'm sure.
Yeah, within that context, first kind of full length sermon sort of situation. So it was a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
3 times is, it's a lot.
Yeah, when you don't really have the context of anything else, it just kind of felt like what we do.
Good point.
So, right, like all the churches I've gone to have had multiple services. The one prior, when I was down in the valley, the church I attended had 5. So it was like Saturday, Sunday situation. So,
Right.
it didn't feel like going from 1 to 3 probably feels really bad.
Yeah.
But for me, it was just like, okay, cool. The interesting thing was they each had kind of their own feel to them. That was the cool thing was like you do the 8 o'clock and then the 9:30 and then the 11 and all of them went a little bit differently. Yep. Now all the content was the same, but it was like some of the responses and reactions in each of the services were totally different.
100%. So. Yeah, I tried to tell a couple of the guys because I know it's their first time doing multiple. Yeah. Right. Maybe not their first time teaching, but first time doing multiple stuff, just trying to manage that different energy in the room. And it's definitely a part of sermon stuff that people just don't know and aren't aware of.
Yeah, you just don't. Yeah. Until you experience it.
Yeah. Until you experience it. Yeah. So, but I thought great content. I think everybody hopefully left challenged, left with a great idea kind of what the Sabbath is, because I think your main point with that was we just don't talk about it a lot.
Yeah, that's kind of where we started is like, hey, we really just don't, in the modern church, we just don't talk about Sabbath all that much. And in culture, we don't really talk about rest all that much either. So inside and outside of the church is kind of a foreign concept.
I mean, so thinking, again, you're not new to church. I mean, you have 2 different backgrounds of church, right? I know we've talked on the podcast on our Roman stuff that you grew up Catholic. Yeah. Does the Catholic Church talk a lot about the Sabbath?
Not that I can remember. And again, we were like very loosely Catholic.
Gotcha.
It was like culturally we were quite Catholic.
Yes.
But I mean, I remember going to Mass a handful of times.
Gotcha.
And we were pretty young when we moved away from that.
Yeah.
And into kind of a Protestant
Christianity. And then down in the valley, did you guys in that church talk about? No. Like when you said that yesterday, I was trying to rack my brain of like, man, I don't know if I've heard very many people teach on it.
The funny thing is I did the 9:30 and our tech director in Prescott Valley shot me a text just saying, hey, man, really encouraging. I was really grateful for it. Hey, man, this is one of the best sermons this might be the best sermon on Sabbath I've ever heard. And cynically, I was like, well, that's because you just haven't heard any sermons on Sabbath, but thank you so much.
Yeah.
But I was really grateful. But yeah, that's kind of the thing is like I can't even remember the last sermon on Sabbath that I heard in person. Like I did a bunch of studying for this message, but we did not. Down at the church I was prior to this, hadn't really taught on it all that much. I'm not sure the last time Jason's taught, at least directly on this idea of Sabbath rest.
Right.
And I don't know why that is. Honestly, like I'm really not all that sure why it is. I can probably make a couple of assumptions, but I don't know.
Yeah. So with that, you had to teach a lot of like backstory on the Sabbath. Again, had to really explain to what people don't know, right? Well, you don't know what you don't know. So we had to explain kind of what the Sabbath is. So with that, I know you kind of talked about 2 things in that main point. And I think one of them was really important. I wanted to kind of nail back into was the theology of work.
Yeah.
Again, we think of the Sabbath as rest, but it also goes hand in hand with, it always says work for 6 days, and then on the 7th day you shall rest. And again, a really, really important thing. I think you could have just taught on that. So any other just points to kind of flesh out there? Again, I know our culture and, our people within our church, we have a mix of people who are working, people who aren't working. And so I thought really good job of hitting both of those. So it just kind of fleshed out maybe a little bit more, the theology of work, because it's a really important aspect, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we probably undersell the value of our work in our culture. And the reality is some of our jobs aren't as meaningful to our society as others, right?
Yeah.
So there is like a very real, what are we producing and what are we contributing to society situation. In the agrarian society, like I had mentioned, that the Israelites lived in just by the nature of the time, the work really mattered.
You weren't eating.
No, you again, if you don't, and that's why that that Exodus 34 text where Moses just reemphasizes a lot of the Ten Commandments, but emphasizes this idea of like, even during the plowing season and even during the harvest, you must rest. It's like, hey, that has so much more weight than I think we can even comprehend. It's like me saying, if I don't go to work on Tuesday, right, then I'm not going to have dinner on my table on Tuesday nights. Like it's very dire within their context. And Moses is saying, hey, God's going to take care of it. Like just do the thing, trust him, be obedient. And we've got a God that is a God of his promise. He's a provider. Like he's going to take care of it. So that doesn't quite, I don't know, cascade as much, but the work emphasis, I think, really, really does. Again, the theology of Sabbath begins with the theology of production. There is more work than there is rest. Like by nature, even when God created the heavens and the earth, he created people. In the creation story, there was more creating than there was resting. And that's the model that, again, Exodus 20 points back to when he says, for in 7 days, the Lord's made the heaven and the earth, all that dwells within them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the seventh day is blessed. He has blessed the seventh day. So I think it's really easy for us to look at Sabbath and think, oh, that's just rest. But it's more work than it is rest. I actually had a conversation with a guy in the lobby after the 11 o'clock service, and he was talking to me, and he felt convicted about, I've known for a long time I need to do this. He's been in church a while, newer to our church, but he's like, I know I need to do this. And he was talking with me about some of the challenges, and one of the challenges was, hey, if I'm off, like totally unreachable from my team for a day, like what if they need something? Like what do I need to do in advance to make sure I can actually take this day off? And I was like, oh, that's a great point that I really couldn't touch on all that much. For those of us who are working, like for me, for instance, if I'm going to take a Sabbath day, I need to make sure that the 6 days of work are really, really intentional. Like I need to get that work done. I need to set up our team here for success so that I can be unreachable for a day a week. Like it takes work in order to get yourself to that place. So that is like a practical thing on work. The other piece of work is just how much work we have to do. So if you're not working, right, flip the table. If you're in the retired category, or maybe you're just not working right now, we have the benefit of having the greatest working field in the history of humanity. Like the Great Commission is the greatest mission that has ever existed in humanity. Like it is, I don't even know, I'm probably underselling the value of the work of the kingdom always, not only just when, again, Moses was trying to teach these things to the Israelites, but even now to this day, like the work that we have in store for us, not even just our work from the 9 to 5, but our ministry kingdom work is so important. And God cares about us spending that time in work. Like he cares about us reaching our neighbor. He cares about us just walking across the street and engaging or parenting our kids in a way, discipling our kids in a way that grows them to the likeness of Jesus. Like all of these things are so important. And that's why part of the thing that I see in this work is the kingdom work. It's not just our physical manual labor, but it's also this gospel-centered Great Commission work that we all have to do. So even if you're not clocking in and out from a 9 to 5 job, like this is the work. You should be honored. Like I feel honored to be able to be a part of that gospel-centered work. And we should do it the majority of the time, but then we should also let ourselves rest. So.
Yeah. And, which makes sense in the way in which God structured the Israelites and the way their community existed. Like everything they did was so communal, right? The Hebrew word shalom is peace. Like it was more than just not at war, but like seeking to make all relationships right. And so everything they did was in the context of community, and I'm doing this so that the community flourishes. So it makes sense that even our work and their aspect was communal. What I'm doing actually contributed to society, contributed to that. And so again, to tell the whole community to cease.
Yeah.
Like it was good for the whole community. It was going to bring value. And I think that's what we see in our culture is the opposite is there are so many hurried and busy and exhausted people. It's likely because we've ignored what is a pretty talked about command in Scripture. I mean, you said 100 and
70 times. Yeah, the word Sabbath is used 170 times in Scripture. And the crazy thing is, for the early church, it was way important.
Yeah.
Like, again, you hear some of the stories of the early church, and it was like they observed the Sabbath. It was part of their rhythm. And we would have to do some church history diving to try to figure out where the drop off was. I know probably the history of the Restoration Movement church, right? Like our style of churches. I don't know if it was ever deeply, deeply important to those churches. So it would be interesting to do that little bit of church history study as to, man, I wonder when we broke off from this thing. Because for a long time, it was very, very important.
Yeah, and again, it makes sense. They were Jewish with their background and their upbringing, and I'm sure blending in some of the Gentile way of life, right? Probably did some things. And again, I think some of the teachings we see from Jesus about the Sabbath, people use in a negative connotation. I know you were talking earlier about Mark. And so I'd love for you to share about Mark, because I know there are things that we can't put in the sermon because we just don't have enough time. And so I know there are a lot of texts that Jesus talks about. So we only talked about Exodus.
Yeah,
right? We didn't even get into the New Testament that talks about 170 times. You couldn't have shared all of those. So, but I do know there's some Mark stuff that I think helps us, because I was thinking through that when you were talking just earlier, even going, we don't talk about it a lot. And I wonder if it's because there's this tension of it not being legalistic, but also like it's important and we should do it. I think we've gone one way or the other.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad you brought up the Mark text. So Mark, the end of Mark chapter 2 and beginning of Mark chapter 3, it's one of those weird chapter breaks that's like right in the middle of a thought. I'm not sure why that is, but it's like this thought at the end of Mark chapter 2 into the beginning of Mark chapter 3. We get these two stories that Mark tells back to back. I don't know how far apart they actually took place, but Mark tells them back to back. And the first story, they both have to do with Jesus and his disciples on the Sabbath. The first has to do, and again, you're likely familiar with them, but he's walking through a field with his disciples, and it's the Sabbath, and they're hungry. I think it's a wheat field, and they're starting to pick some of the kernels of wheat to eat as they're walking through. And there's this group of Pharisees that's kind of looking at him and saying, hey, how dare you break the Sabbath command by picking a kernel of wheat to eat, right? And Jesus rebukes them and has this great comeback. This tells the story of David going into the temple when he and his buddies were hungry and taking some food on the Sabbath and giving it not only to himself but to the people he was with. And then he ends with this line, right? The man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for the man. And it's this. And then he goes on to say even more so. He makes this proclamation. Jesus says, and I am the Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Essentially saying, like, I have dominion over this spiritual practice that you Pharisees actually are doing wrong anyways. And we'll learn a little bit more about that in the second story, right? So the second story in the book of Mark, it's chapter 3 here. Jesus and his Pharisees are walking along, and he encounters a man, encounters a man with an ailment. He has a shriveled hand. And Mark gives us this context, which I think is just so funny. Mark says, he writes in the book, hey, the Pharisees were looking over Jesus and the disciples, and they were trying to catch them in some sort of sin. They were trying to look for some sort of wrong that they were doing so that ultimately they could, diminish the power of Jesus, diminish his ministry here on earth, whether that was legally or, trying to crucify him or whatever it was that their goal was. At the end of the chapter, it actually talks about the Pharisees' desire to have Jesus killed. So it's pretty serious. So the Pharisees are just kind of looking at him, trying to find the gotcha moment. And Jesus recognizes that that's exactly what they're doing. So Jesus encounters this man, and it's crazy because oftentimes as you see some of the miracles of Jesus, a lot of them, especially the healings, are done pretty privately. Jesus has personal interactions with people, sometimes heals people, and then even goes as far as to say, hey, don't tell anyone about this, right? He goes as far as to say, it's not time yet, so just keep this to yourself, which I'm sure is really hard to do. But in this instance, he looks at this man with the shriveled hand and he says, hey, stand up in front of everybody. I have a point to make. I want you to stand up, and the Pharisees are going to see. I want everyone to see what's about to happen. So the man stands up, and Jesus just says, hey, stretch out your arm. And he heals him, and his hand is healed, ultimately changing this guy's life forever, I'm sure. And in the midst of it, he has this back and forth with the Pharisees. And he asks this question, hey, is it more righteous to do good or evil on the Sabbath? Because they didn't want him to heal him, right? Because the Pharisees are rebuking him for breaking Sabbath command. And Jesus says, well, is it more holy to do good or to evil, to save a life or to take one? And he's obviously proving the point to the Pharisees that what he is doing is good and holy, this healing work of the Sabbath, even though he's doing it on the Sabbath, which the Pharisees never would have. Like, it's holy and it's good. So getting all the way back to the point, here's kind of the point of me sharing those two stories. I would have loved for them to be in the message, but it's just another 20 minutes on top of everything I already said. But the whole point is this. There is such a cultural night and day difference from what our 21st century American culture, especially in the church, thinks about the Sabbath and what the Pharisees that Jesus was actually talking to in these moments thinks about the Sabbath, right? The Pharisees had created this whole construct that was, it's called Mishnah law. They created all of these rules and regulations, this whole construct and framing, scaffolding around how do we just stay as far from breaking the law as we possibly can? So imagine, like, if you've got this bullseye, right? You've got this target. In the very center, you've got something that can break law. You've got sin in the center. Outside of that, you've got the law of Moses, like all of the laws of the Old Testament. And then on the outside of that, you have Mishnah law. They had created all of this scaffolding around just to try to stay holy. Ultimately, it was really well intended at the beginning. They just wanted to stay holy. But with wanting to stay holy and creating your own worldly laws, what comes with that is legalism. So what Jesus had understood about the Pharisees is they had taken this idea of observing the Sabbath to such a legalistic extreme by observing the Mishnah law, which was the only law that Jesus broke, right? It's not a biblical law or commands. Right. It was always these Mishnah constructs. He stayed true to the Sabbath commands of the Old Testament. But he was pushing them on these ideas of, hey, you actually created these laws. I'm not sure why you're holding them as high, even higher regards to the law of Moses oftentimes. So what he was saying to them is, hey, this is important, right? This idea of Sabbath rest and the Sabbath command is incredibly important. But when you take it to such an extreme to where you're not going to do good works on the Sabbath, you're not going to, again, heal or save, do good or evil.
Doesn't he use another example too in Matthew about, like, if a neighbor's animal falls in a hole?
Yeah.
The same way. It's the same, like, you wouldn't look at it and be like, sorry, dude,
man,
can't help you.
Got 12 more hours.
Yeah, which they would have said, oh, I can't do that.
Yeah. But what Jesus is saying to them is like, hey, there are good things you can do on the Sabbath. Like, it's the mindset and it's how intentionally you spend that time intentionally to honor God with that time. So the whole reason I'm trying to compare and contrast these two things is, like, our culture couldn't be further from the legalism that the Pharisees would have existed with.
Exactly.
So we're way over here to where we don't even care.
Nope.
We don't care about giving up that time. And in fact, most people probably think Sabbath is just rest to themselves. They think sitting on the couch and watching Netflix for 9 hours just fine because it's my Sabbath day. When in reality, it's a day we give to the Lord, to where the Pharisees were on the way other end of the spectrum. So you'll see in the New Testament, as Jesus interacts with the Sabbath, I don't know how relevant it is to our cultural position today,
right,
all the times, because he was trying to fight against the Pharisees, which had such a different cultural understanding of Sabbath than we do to this day. Now, there's still so much good that we can learn from Jesus. There's also a text in Hebrews, is it Hebrews 12 that talks about the Lord of the Sabbath?
I don't know.
I think it is, and that's really good also. That kind of reemphasizes a lot of what Jesus said during his ministry on the Sabbath. But so there's kind of the compare and contrast of why I didn't get all that much into Jesus on the Sabbath, because I would have had to go through and lay all that context of, hey, Jesus is talking to people that think about this issue so differently than we do. Yeah. But it's all still really, really good.
Yeah, and I think our fear is we always hear we don't want to be like the Pharisees. Yeah. Right. But again, like you said, the intention actually was they were trying to be so holy and so righteous. They missed the point, right? The law in of itself became the thing that they were chasing after. And we learned that in the Romans, right? That idea of that's not how you actually find righteousness. There's not through the law. So we don't teach that. So again, it's like, well, we don't want to, and we're so grace-filled, like, oh, it's all about grace, and we just have to love and follow Jesus. We don't have to do all these things. And it's like, I don't know, man, it feels like this is a big one.
It is a command. So actually, yeah, I'd said a minute ago, I'm not sure why our culture, especially church culture, doesn't talk about Sabbath. And I wonder if that's not it, right? It's this idea that, hey, Jesus was pretty harsh on the Pharisees around this idea of Sabbath. So we're going to swing the pendulum way in the other direction. When the reality with any of this stuff is like probably somewhere right in the middle is the most holy.
Yeah, the most holy, 100%.
So, observation of the Sabbath, but not legalism of the Sabbath.
Yeah, 100%. Now, you said something too really interesting about, 6 days we work, we set aside it as holy. And so for our folks who are retired, who are listening, we realize that's a decent majority of our church, right? You've retired, you've come to Prescott. I know you talked about in the sermon, this idea, a lot of times we're finally retired and we're really busy, and you kind of made that idea, like being busy, we get to, number one, choose what we're busy. Yeah. And two, being busy is not an excuse to outright disobey.
Yeah.
And so how do we balance that? Because again, their work isn't the same, right? They're no longer clocking in, clocking out. So how do we make that day holy?
Yeah.
Right. Like that's a important, if it is set apart, what does that look like? Right. Because I think it's an important concept here.
Yeah. That's really good. So I used that word, and actually at the 8 o'clock, I used it, but didn't dig into it. And then Jason came back to me afterwards and was like, hey, you should probably dig into that a little bit more. Cause I know what you mean when you say that, but I'm not sure everyone else does. So if you came to the 8, again, it probably wasn't as clear. As I was talking about the way that the Jews still observe the Sabbath, again, you go to Israel on the Sabbath today, it's going to be quiet and very, very different than what we would experience, even in downtown Prescott, which is much more quiet on a Sunday morning than most places. But, to the Jewish faith, they still have a high value on this Sabbath day because to them, it is a holy day, right? That word holy day just means set apart. It's a day that's set apart from the rest for a specific purpose. For our purpose within Sabbath rest is to commune with God. It's to break away from the rhythms and routines that we're in and spend time communing with God. The whole thing with setting it apart, right, especially if you don't have a regular schedule, if you're maybe retired and your schedule changes so much, is like what sets a thing apart? It's different from the rest, right? That is like by the literal definition of set apart. It just has to look and feel different from everything else. So if all 7 days of your week look exactly the same, you are not Sabbathing. Like just simply put, there has to be something about the Sabbath that sets that day apart from the rest. Now, I would suggest a really easy place to start if you don't even know what that looks like is by utilizing those 4 literal translations of the Hebrew word Shabbat that I talked about right at the end. It means ceasing, stopping and ceasing. It looks like rest. It looks like delighting in the gifts God has given us. And it looks like worshiping the God who's given us those gifts, right? And that's a good way for that day to feel set apart from the rest. I had a friend who's been here way, way longer than I have, older gentleman, far retired, who came to me after the 8 o'clock service. And he said, so good. Such a great reminder. Thanks for the message. And he goes, the hard thing? The hard thing for me is sometimes I don't even know what day it is anymore. He goes, when you're retired, man, I don't know if it's Tuesday or Thursday or sometimes I just don't know.
Man.
So it was such a good reminder for him that, man, if we're going to set aside a day for the Sabbath, like we need to know what that day is and we need it to look differently than the rest of our days, or else how is it any different? How is it set apart at all? So.
Yeah. And again, it's back to the Matthew passage of the Great Commission.
Yeah.
We're called to work. Mm-hmm. And I know many of us, when we're, in our stage with young families and all that things that go with that, and then work and a pastor, all the things we sometimes lament if we just had more time. I wish I had more time to do these things, to serve the church more and to love my neighbor and to be in my community. And I know a lot of people who are retired, they said that in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah.
And what we're just trying to push against is, the busy side of it is, man, make sure that involves kingdom work, because you now actually have that time that you wanted. Because we all want that. And again, we get it. Like I get it, right? You get it. We wanted more. And we say that, if I just had more time. And now they have that. And so that example of those stories from the Piper book, I don't want to get to heaven with a jar of seashells. Like, I don't want that to be the end. If I'm careening off a cliff with, my ride or die, and we're just rolling out trying to tell people about Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm like, what a better way to enter the kingdom.
Yeah.
But that's, again, I think that's also this idea of our bad theology of work.
Yeah.
We think we get to a certain age and we're done.
Yeah.
Because we just see work as a thing that I do to get the things that I want.
Yeah. Right.
And I've gotten the things that I want, and now I have the retirement or whatever. So now I get to check out of society in a way, right? And I'm not still engaging in certain aspects, and we just want to make sure that we're not doing that here. Yeah,
that's really good. And I wonder if we can't flip the way that we think about kind of that work post-retirement on its head a little bit. The whole idea, right? The American dream is to put in your 35 years and to cash in on your retirement and to live a good life somewhere sunny and warm, right? Whether it's Arizona or Florida, right? That's typically, if you're in the Midwest, so growing up in the Midwest, it's like, man, if you can retire to Phoenix or
if you can make it to Florida, you're a success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, it's this idealism around it. But I wonder if we can't like flip it on its head and say, man, retirement is the season of life in which we get to choose the most meaningful work we'll ever be a part of.
Yeah.
Like, rather than retirement is where we get to stop working and just do whatever we want. Yeah. I wonder if we can't just say, man, instead of selling widgets for 35 years, now I get to go make disciples, like make more and more disciples of Jesus, do that Great Commission work. Again, if you haven't done that, it is just the most fulfilling and also most challenging, hard, sometimes discouraging work you'll ever do. But it is the most fulfilling work I think any of us could ever be a part of. And I think that's what God's saying to us, especially those of us who no longer have to clock in and out from a job, is like, man, I have some work that is so much greater than what you've ever experienced in store for you. And I just hope we can encourage people like, hey, if you're retired, you've got, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years, 20 years left to do that work and reap the benefit of it.
Yeah, I was reading an article, I don't know, probably a year ago, and I actually gave it to Jason. It kind of talked about this in, I think, South Korea. Most of their missionaries are 60 plus.
Oh, wow.
Because they look at it that way. So they wanted to work. When they get to that age, the church is sending them out. Like, go now, plant churches, make disciples. And it's like their greatest numbers are older folks because they have the time. Yeah. Because, again, you're not raising your family. That is the tension for all of us, is when you're raising that family, there isn't a value of pouring into them and making sure they know Jesus and that they're disciples.
And that's your work.
And that is work, real hard work. And so when that season is over, right, you do have opportunities to do that. And we have a ton of people who are plugged in, not just to our church, but the community and serving. We just want all of us to remember that we want to do kingdom work. Yeah. And we really want to be reminded of that and kind of go after, because like you said, if you do that for 6 days all out, you'll need that rest.
Oh, man. And especially if you're doing gospel-centered work, there is no more...
It's exhausting.
Discouraging sometimes work to do than trying to bring people to Jesus. So how could you expect yourself to be fueled for gospel-centered work if you are not centering your life around Jesus at least on one full day per week? Like, that's another way, again, I couldn't get that into the message, but that's another way I've personally thought about it, like with my vocation and with the work that we do. How do I expect myself to be an effective husband and father and pastor if I am not rooting my life in Jesus with a Sabbath day?
Right.
So that's been fueling me.
And what you kind of touched on that, I loved the end, the Matthew text. Again, it's not just talking about Sabbath.
No.
But I think, man, you connected some dots. I think, even for me and hopefully other people, of like, if I'm actually doing this regularly, I will experience rest for my soul regularly, instead of, for most of it, it's when we've tried everything else and it's like, okay, I'll come to Jesus, right? That's when I'll finally come to you. Let me do all my other ways. Let me take all the things. And now, all those worldly things are good. They didn't work, but trying to connect in those dots, that I actually have the opportunity maybe weekly to experience this, so maybe burnout wouldn't happen as regularly, right?
Yeah, again, this rhythm, I can't understand. One of the coolest bits of study that I did was this idea. It was a Comer thought in one of his books or on a podcast maybe that I listened to, this idea that like some of the reason Sabbath is so important is because it's been literally ingrained into the DNA of humanity from the very beginning of time. I love that Exodus 20 points back to Genesis 1, the creation story, because God had a plan for us. Like very clearly, he had a plan for the way he was creating us to exist and thrive here on this earth. And we broke part of that plan, and we're dealing with a lot of the consequences of that fall. But the plan is still kind of in play. Like the rhythm of 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. Man, again, that French Revolution whole story shows us that when we try to reject that system that we've been created to exist within, we're going to be broken. We're going to feel the negative consequences of our choice to reject the system God's creating. That's true for all sorts of stuff. Like that idea of when we try to reject God's plan for us, it's going to go pretty wrong pretty quick. But it's such a practical way to think about it within the Sabbath rest, because again, we all feel exhausted and burnt out and burdened, but we're not even doing the thing that God asked of us in restoring some of our soul through Sabbath rest in him. 1 day per week. So that was, for me, as I was going through the study, there was a lot of fun. I learned a ton. That was the thing that stuck to me. It's like, oh, God did this for us. He's asking us to do this for a reason, because he always knows better than we do for ourselves. We just need to be obedient to it.
And we wonder, again, I think you created that tension really well. We wear it like a badge of honor. I'm really busy. And then we wonder why everything's falling apart.
You know what's crazy?
Our marriages, our families, our relationships, our work, because we can't physically hold it all together. We just don't have enough time, but we're trying. Boy, we keep trying, don't we? We just keep, and you look at people, and you said it, I think in the 8 o'clock maybe, like I see on your faces. Like, it's not like we hide it well. We think we do. Oh, I'm great, just doing awesome. Like, people can see it on you when you're just exhausted. And we think, well, I'll take a vacation and I'll take off day, but like, we're just not actually resting.
We haven't talked about this yet, so this might be a fun little 2-minute tidbit. At what point did being busy make us more important?
I don't know.
Like, when did that become, man, I got to go to this thing, and then I've got this other thing over here, then I'm on the Zoom call for this other thing that I'm doing. Like, at what point was that a status symbol of success in our culture? Because I don't know if certainly Jesus didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. Like in the gospel of Jesus, he's walking from place to place. Like, he is communing with
life. With a lot of take your time.
Yeah, man, he's going. I mean, you see it in the story of Lazarus, even like what. He was not in a hurry.
Never.
But at what point did we start to see more value in just getting up and going and never stopping, and the things that we do in any given week? When did we start to see more value in that than we do in just serving God in the ways he's asked us to? So I just
it's interesting. So there was an article or a post about a GM who posted like, I sometimes take my pillow to the office, right? And I sleep in the office, and I work 60, 70 hours a week. And a former coach goes, "What are you doing?" He was like, "I told my guys, you need to, if you're here at night, like, I'm going to fire you. Go home, be with your family. We're taking, Saturday off, right?" And then a couple other coaches, always they just chimed in like, "Yeah, man, we don't do stuff on Sunday." Like, but seeing that correlation again, but he was bragging like, "Oh yeah, man, I sleep in the office."
Oh, we've all done it,
and we love it. And you're right, it's like
grit.
Like, look at that guy. He's a hard worker. 70 hours. Look at 70 hours a week. And I think we've maybe correlated working hard with doing more, right? And again, the beauty of the farmer life is they work really, really hard, but the sun goes down and they have to stop. And they do, right? And sometimes when it's growing season, like, they're still working, but it's different.
Yeah, we're going all over the place here, but there's just some thoughts that are coming to mind. Man, if we are expected, we talk a lot about perseverance here. We talk a whole lot about this idea of the perseverance of the faith, how we need to keep going. In fact, one of Paul's greatest lines in all of Scripture was, "I have run the race. I have persevered." Right? Like this idea of, man, I made it to the end. How do we expect to make it to the end if we never stop? Like that's not how things are designed to be. Nope. If we run our vehicle, 5,000 RPMs everywhere we're going, every time we drive it, we're going to throw a rod. We're going to blow a seal. Like something bad is going to happen. Yeah. And the same is true for us. Like if we expect to run the race, to finish with perseverance, like to actually make it through this kingdom work that we've been called to do, we have to stop. Like we have to release and remember, because again, it gets so sideways. We start to think that the only reason any of this stuff is happening is because of me. We get to think, oh man, we had 100 baptisms this last year at Quad City. That's because I've been working so hard. It's like as soon as we get to that place, we get so sideways. Because again, God invites us into this work, but that's by his grace. That's not for us, right? Like he invites us into that work and it's a blessing, but we need to be obedient to this command to just stop and release it back to him because we're not in control anyways.
Definitely not in control. Switch gears a little bit. I know you talked about right before we got into the practical, the how. So we got the why and we got the what is it, and then the how. Why really important because a lot of people don't know what to do. They're Brendan, where do I start? I've never heard of this concept. What? Interesting. You were just real honest and said, "Hey, I looked and went, nah, I'm not doing that. I should teach on it because it will convict me, and then I will have to put this into practice." Because we don't want to tell people, our saying around here, we don't do what we're not telling other people to do.
Yeah. We're not going to ask anyone to do anything we're not willing to do.
So what have you seen? Just some encouraging moments for you. What does it look like practically? So maybe the how-to, and you touched a little bit on it, right? But I think just giving people who are going, okay, I've never really done this, because we've seen that with a lot of these spiritual disciplines that we have people who like this is brand new. Yeah. So maybe like what you've seen in your life over the last 4 months, what's the things you've learned? If you could give 2 or 3 things, hey, this is the really big pieces of it. Just kind of talking practically your life. What does it look like this is what I do. This is what my day would, because again, you made the comment, it's not Netflix for 9 hours, but I thought, Brendan, you told me to rest, and that's rest for me. But so what does that look like? And again, it's not, is it me doing chores? Is it me going to the grocery store? Like, what is all of that? How do we help people go, oh, that's what he's talking about? Okay, I can do that.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm happy to do that. I think that somewhere in Scripture it says to set your screen limit time to 15 minutes a day anyway. So, like, don't exceed that. Yeah. No, just kidding. So here's, I'll just do a rundown, right? This is all I know is what I do right now, right? So, and again, part of the reason Sabbath is really hard is because it's kind of abstract. Rest for me doesn't look like rest for you. And Josh, you and I rest very different ways. So rest looks different depending on how God created you to exist, right? So for me, what it looks like, I'll go all the way through, my Sabbath 20-ish, 24-ish hours. All right, so Thursday night for me, I leave my laptop at home. I get home. My Sabbath doesn't start right until a little bit before sundown. For me, during life group seasons, our life group meets on Thursday nights. I actually think that's an incredible way for me to kick off my Sabbath. I love being able to we share a meal and we hang out for a couple hours, and it's a really good time just to it's like the letdown from the week for me. It's like I can just like breathe like a little bit slower, and that's when it starts. We go home. We always go to bed pretty early, so it's typically go home, help Porter get ready for bed, and we go to bed. And Friday I'll wake up, and my wife's a teacher, so during the school year she takes Porter to school. He is in first grade this year. She teaches all day, so I've got this like 8 or 9 hour period where I'm just solo and I'm doing whatever it is that I feel. Again, I lean into prayer and the power of the Holy Spirit to say, hey, what do I do today? Oftentimes that looks like pretty early in the day I'll go outside somewhere, so I'll spend a couple hours, 2-3 hours riding my mountain bike, or I'll go for a hike. Sometimes I've got a really good friend who's a rock climber here in town who attends our church as well. Sometimes we'll just go out climbing together and hang out for a few hours. And that's really, really good. That's a great way for me to start my day of Sabbath. After that, I'll go grab some food because I love food. So I'll go grab a good meal and And then later on in the day, I'll come back home. And again, this is probably the most ambiguous part of my Sabbath is like that late afternoon. Maybe I'll do a little bit of reading, just kind of hanging on the couch, sitting around. If it feels restful. So here's a bit of the thing, right? If it feels restful to me, every once in a while, I'll do a little bit of cleaning around the house. Not because I feel like I have to, but because there's a restful act of me throwing in some headphones and doing some dishes and having a clean house, right? Now, a little bit of a warning there, because if you're doing it because you feel like you have to, it's probably not rest.
Probably not.
So if I feel like, man, I've got to get home and I've got to clean the house, it's like, nah, I'm not going to do that today, actually.
Yeah.
Because it's me surrendering. I will do that tomorrow morning, first thing, right? Or maybe I'll do it right after sundown tonight, but I'm not going to do it right now. It can wait. But if I feel like it's enhancing my time with God, then yeah, okay, I can do a little bit of dishes, I can clean the house and whatever else it is. So sometimes it's that, sometimes it's the polar opposite of that. And it's me just sitting down on the couch and doing some reading. Then I'll pick Porter up from school. He's usually off school in the mid-late afternoon. We'll do that. We'll on Fridays, every once in a while, we'll grab ice cream on the way home or whatever it is. Just for, again, it's he and I, and it's just a good bonding thing. It's the rhythm we're in at the end of a school week. Kind of celebrate, man, you had such a good week. Like we'll go do something fun. And then the evening is delight for me. It's like, how do I intentionally delight in the time I have with my family? So with Porter, we'll go for a walk or a bike ride, or we'll go play catch in the backyard. Sometimes it's as simple as that. And then, Courtney will get off work and we'll hang out. We'll do dinner more often than not, whether we do that at home or go out for a meal. Oftentimes we'll do that on Friday. And then, like, genuinely, I said it in the message probably, but sitting down on the couch and just watching a movie to wrap up our evening, like for us is like, we just sit and we hang and we throw a blanket on and we eat some popcorn and we just spend this time together and we make funny jokes and just hang out together. And that's just kind of the, generally speaking, what my Sabbath day looks like. Yeah. A couple of things on it. Sometimes going for a bike ride in the morning doesn't feel right. Sometimes it doesn't feel restful for me. And on those weeks, I just don't do that. Like I go do something, I think there's a real interesting way that God can use his spirit to speak to you in that moment of like, it feels like I'm trying to force this and that's not really what I want it to feel like. So maybe I'll just go walk. Maybe I'll just go for a hike instead, or I'll go do something else. Maybe I'll do like just spend some time reading in the morning and do something else in the afternoon. So, if something isn't working, like if you try this out and some part of your rhythm just isn't working, don't try to force it. Like, don't try to keep doing it. In fact, if it's not working, if it doesn't feel restful, maybe God's trying to say something to you in the midst of that. So that's like the top priority on Sabbath is intentionality. Second, for me, is flexibility around what do I feel most rested doing right now? So that was a lot.
No, that's great. I love that second piece, the flexibility, because I think what we are struggling with the most in our culture is we have no flexibility in our schedules. Every moment is taken.
Yep.
Like if we open most everyone's calendar, there is no flexibility. No. So to wake, and it freaks people out. Like what you just said to people, they're going, wait a minute. I'm going to come home and I may do this. I may do that. Literally, I was talking with somebody about this not too long ago and they're like, I'm not going to do anything. What about the dishes and the housework and the chore? Like I'm not supposed to do anything. I'm like, you're missing the point. It's not that you have to.
You're doing everything, actually.
Yeah, you are doing stuff.
Yeah.
But you're doing stuff that is healing and restorative. Like Jesus is saying to the guy, the Sabbath is healing.
It's a day of healing.
It's a day of healing and restorative work. And so again, people are probably hearing that going, wait a minute, hold up. I thought it was a day to like catch up on all the things that I didn't get done.
Yeah.
Because work was busy this week. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's what we've intentionally, that's what Sunday is like, well, I came, I did worship. Now I'm going to go home and do all my chores. Because for a lot of people, that's when Sabbath is Sunday, if they even think about practicing at all.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Again, like I jokingly say, Sabbath is the day where we don't do anything, or really we do everything, because man, just what is more important than having a restorative day with God? Yeah. Like that has got to be some of the most powerful work. And again, so many of us don't do that. We'll take 5 minutes here, 20 minutes there and try to, throw the Band-Aid on real quick.
Yeah.
So why do you think it is that people have a hard time stopping and doing nothing?
I don't know. Maybe it's back to your whole point of like, that's in our culture now what's valued the most. If I'm super busy and I do all this stuff, then I have to be successful.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. I think there's this other thing that happens, and I could be guilty of this a lot. For some of you, this might resonate and this might hurt a little, so I apologize in advance. It can be really, really hard, right? A lot of us build our lives around being busy constantly because we're afraid of what's going to happen when we stop. Like from a couple of different lenses. If we're not contributing, then what value are we? Like as people, like what value am I adding if I'm not contributing something, if I'm not producing? And on the flip side, some of us just don't really like what happens in our own head when we're not busy. Like some of us don't love the thought life that we have. This idea of like being really self-critical and negative. And when we stop, the voice in our head gets a lot louder.
Yep.
And my encouragement to you is like, man, we can keep ignoring that if we want to, but it's just going to get worse. It's just going to turn out 20, 30, 40 years down the road with all these unresolved thoughts that you have about yourself and your life and whatever else it is. Wouldn't you so much rather spend this time in quiet rest in the presence of the Lord and just like ask him to work through that with you, right? And that's really ambiguous. There's, I'm sure, all sorts of practices and sorts of things that we can get into around that idea. But I think a lot of people are just scared to stop and just to do the thing, which is why it's so hard. Like it is a discipline.
Yeah, it is very true. I love you're trying to teach Porter that, right? Even, intentional trying to, hey, we're going to do this on Fridays. We've tried to do with the kids is just teaching them, a lot of times our Sabbath, we call it our do nothing day, meaning like we have nothing on the calendar that demands that we do something, that we have the flexibility and the freedom to just go and be a family. If a friend calls and says, you want to grab dinner? Absolutely. We want to hang out with you, right? Hey, do we all just want to sit in our room and pick up a book? Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that, right? That we just have the flexibility to, hey, we're going to wake up a little bit later and we're going to sleep in. And Dad's actually going to take a nap. And I hate napping. But, man, there's something to it, right? Yeah. It's restorative and God breathed and he gives life to it. And so it's important, I think, that we're teaching this to our family. So it's one of these things we don't talk about enough. And so we need to talk about it more. We need to share more about the Sabbath. I know John Mark Comer, like he talks about it all the time. It's just super valuable. All his insights that he's banging the drum for us to hear it, right?
Yep.
And again, so share your wins, your losses, have accountability in it.
And it's so encouraging, too. When I hear a story of like, oh, man, we had the best day. And we did nothing. We just had the best day.
We had the best day.
That's so encouraging.
Yeah. And you're intentional. I think that's a big piece that a lot of times going in, what you're going to do is huge. All right. Again, I think if
I'll spend all week planning my Sabbath.
Yeah.
I'm not even joking.
Yeah. So if we leave it wide open, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
The bad habits are going to creep in. I do love that you talked about the technology piece. You lay that down. I think that's a big part of Sabbath in our culture. And I think it comes in, and we're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks with Silence and Solitude. Our culture is so noisy. I think the Sabbath gives us a chance to be still and silent and pray. It's not all that. I don't think it's all of it, but I do. I know we were going to chat about that. We don't want to now because we're going to have a whole sermon on it.
Yeah, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, I am too, really because it's a big deal. I don't think we realize how noisy our culture is.
Yeah. Well, because we're just in it. I mean,
just all the time.
We're barely above water. And again, like, I don't know, if you're in the water, it's hard to see what's around you. But if you're floating 30,000 feet above the water and you take a step back, which I think Sabbath is that for us, I think it's a massive step back to breathe and gain more of a global perspective as to what's happening in our life and what God's doing in and through his Spirit in us. We can actually see. We can see all of these things that are around us, and again, how noisy it can be and how to avoid some of the unhelpful and unnecessary noise.
Yeah, like turning the phone off. Or hey, man, maybe your Sabbath is every Sabbath I'm calling grandkids. And we're gonna
that's really good.
We're gonna chat with them, and I'm gonna ask them what their things are going on in their life, and I'm gonna be intentional about giving them my undivided time, because that is your delight, right? Again, that's that to your point, it's so different for all of us.
That's really good.
What it looks like, for each and every one of us, I'm able to, or maybe it's my Sabbath, I'm checking in on my friends.
Yeah.
I'm going to go, hey, how are you doing, man? Hey, let's go grab coffee. because I have noon and I want to just go sit and I don't have to look at my phone going, oh, I got to be at this meeting. I have to get there, I actually want to be able to do that. So anything else that we can share with folks, any other piece that may be super important just for someone who's new at this and they're about to jump in and they're going, okay, I felt the conviction. I want to change. I'm going to do it.
Yep.
What do we tell them?
That's really good. So here's the most important couple of pieces. So if you're someone, right, I'm going to start just from nothing. You're not doing anything in regards to Sabbath rest. Sometimes you take a vacation and then you feel more tired when you come back, right? Have you ever had that feeling? So here's the deal. Just try it.
Yep.
So even if that looks like 6 hours, right? 6 hours on a Saturday morning, right? Just start somewhere intentionally. That's, again, the big thing is being really intentional with our time. And be prepared to fail. Like I probably have like a 20% failure rate on Sabbath days.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it just doesn't feel, and when I say failure, I don't mean like failure. I mean like it didn't feel the way I wanted it to, or there was something, I had this expectation that was unmet. As much as we can possibly like relieve ourselves of the expectation and just try to do the things that we feel God's asking us to do to rest, like that is success in the midst of this. So just be prepared for it to not be what you maybe think it's going to be. Sabbath in and of itself is not going to fix your problems. It's not going to fill any voids that we have in our lives. However, it is a releasing of control and a stepping into the presence of God to allow him to do his restorative work in us.
Yep.
That was that whole ceasing and resting piece. Is what we're doing is we're just releasing control.
Yep.
And we're intentionally asking God to restore us, to grow us into the likeness of his son, Jesus, through rest. So first big thing, right? Just start somewhere little, start small. It's totally fine. 6 hours a week even, and expect for it to be different than you think it's going to be. And then the second piece is, right, plan, but be flexible. I know that's hard for some of you. Sometimes planning is really hard for you. Sometimes being flexible, you got to be both, honestly. Because as soon as we overstructure, it's going to feel like work. It's going to feel like we're checking it off the list. And we just can't do that.
Yeah.
Again, to my point earlier, sometimes I wake up thinking, here's what I'm going to do. And it just isn't right. I can't really explain that. There's just a nudge of the Spirit saying, nah, go do this instead. Yep. So be prepared to be a little bit flexible. And if you've got kids, especially, just be gracious to yourself, to your kids, to your spouse. It's a discipline for a reason. It is hard. It takes a little bit of working out to build the muscle of Sabbath. But man, I just believe, like I genuinely believe some of the pieces of the puzzle that God is helping me to see right now is this end of Matthew 11 style rest for our souls that so many of us are in such desperate need for. Like we've got to be obedient to this system he's created, this Sabbath command he's given us, because he knows so much better for us than we know for ourselves. And I just feel like these two things are in some way, shape, or form like connected. And if we can just surrender a day and be in the presence of God, like maybe, just maybe, we'll experience a rest for our souls.
Yeah. And we got a ton of resources for you. We don't want to leave you hanging. I know on our resources page, we have some stuff from John Mark, from his Practicing the Way stuff, a great little something to read, put some more tangible stuff on. You mentioned Ruthless Elimination of Hurry.
Yeah.
You mentioned another book too, just in our chatting time. What was that book again that you read?
Yeah, so one of the first books, I read a book about a year ago because this has been a problem for a while. So just a fair warning. It's not like, I realized it was a problem 4 months ago and now it's fixed. It's been like years. I've been convicted by this idea of Sabbath for years. I was talking to a counselor one time. Courtney and I went on a retreat. This really like intensive marriage thing. It was awesome. It was incredible. Some good friends of ours. And this counselor who I really look up to is like, hey, you should read this book because I think it's a problem for you. I think this rest. I don't think you like to rest. And I was like, oh, you're right. And it's called The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan. And it was really, really profound. And now I'm actually starting to put some of those things into practice.
Yeah. But again, so if you're one of those guys or ladies that struggle with this, that productivity is your, and again, I love you were honest and you called it your idol.
Yeah, 100%.
You, like Brendan can chat with you and you can feel that again, because I think it's just naming that and then exploring like, well, how do I fix that? Like, I have to each week lay that down.
Yeah.
It kind of helps that. Again, so John Mark has that book. He's got some great stuff on with the theology of work. His Garden City book is fantastic. It's all about that, how we were created.
You just gave it to me, and I haven't read it yet, so I'm really excited.
Eugene Peterson, he doesn't, I don't know if he has any books on the Sabbath. He just talked about when he was planting a church and doing church work, it just became the thing he did.
Yeah.
And it just saturated his life. Mm-hmm. And you go, well, I feel like that's what I should do, right? And so again, the Abraham Joshua Heschel, that quote's fantastic.
He's got a book you like, right?
It's called The Sabbath, and it's 70 pages. It's really short. And it literally, I read that book and walked away going, that man really delights in God. The way he spoke of God was just so different.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe it's because he just did Sabbath, and I want that.
It's his roots. It's his heritage.
It's who he is, right? And so I learned something from that.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of resources that are available for if you aren't sure of what to do, or if you just need more conviction. Maybe there's a lot of stuff out there from really helpful.
Yeah, another one, Henry Nouwen has a couple of good books on this idea of rest. He's great. If you've not read any of his stuff, he's really, really solid. He has got a book that I just read that's leans a little bit more towards silence and solitude. So maybe it'll be like a two birds with one stone sort of situation for one of the messages coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's called The Ways of the Heart, I believe, by Henry Nouwen. And what he does is, he wrote this paper with a bunch of other doctorate students all about the 4th century desert fathers and mothers and the routines they were in by walking into the desert and living there for an extended period of time in solitude and silence. And it talks a little bit about this idea of rest and the need for silence and Sabbath. And I read that recently. It's really good.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a ton of stuff. Again, we'd be honored to have conversations with you. I know that's a part of what we enjoy, right? To help people live these things out. And again, they are disciplines. So give yourself a break. I love that you gave people permission to kind of fail at this and stumble around. Gosh, man, we've been trying as a family to do this for 3 or 4 years, and sometimes we're great, and other seasons we're not awesome. We feel that. We can feel that in our family structure and way of life when we're overcommitted and too busy and haven't just stopped to be a family and delight. And I feel that in my own life. And so, man, it's something we want to be really intentional with. And so we just want to help you do that. So again, tons of resources online. It'll be with the video, this podcast. Man, make sure you check those out. A lot of great authors that are kind of talking about this, and a lot of great authors who have talked about it in the past. They've been banging the drum like, hey, church, we should do this thing, wake up. Anything else that you want to add before we kind of bounce off?
No, just, again, don't get too discouraged. It's really, really hard work. Just keep it up, right? It's just like any of the other spiritual disciplines. You just got to put in the work, and you've got to commit to doing the thing, because we know, right, if God tells us that it's a part of the rhythm that we should be living within, like, he knows something more about that rhythm than we do. And I think there's more in store for the way that we live than what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, man, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Hope you are encouraged to jump in and try this. We'll be back next week kind of chatting. Next week's spiritual discipline we're talking through is prayer. So looking forward to that conversation and going deeper in that, and just maybe moving prayer off of the thing we do before we eat, but really like, this is a way to commune and chat with God. So excited about that. Again, thanks for joining us. Talk real soon.
Yeah, thanks.